Lorraine Jacobs and Harold Whitmore were both 60 years old when they found love again. But just months after their quiet backyard wedding, their blended families erupted into chaos. Their children's growing resentment turned from bitter words to dark secrets. And what began as a joyful, late-hype romance would spiral into surveillance, betrayal, and ultimately, cold-blooded murder. Harold Brennan had spent most of his adult life in the same quiet Ohio town where he was born. After losing his wife to cancer 7 years earlier, he had settled into a slow rhythm, morning walks, crossword puzzles, and attending church every Sunday. He never thought he would fall in love again. At 60, he believed that part of his life was behind him. But life has a strange way of surprising those who have given up on surprises. Lorraine Whitaker moved into town after her husband died of a heart attack. She was a retired librarian with a calm presence and a kind smile. Lorraine wasn't looking for anyone either. Her days were filled with tending her garden, reading mysteries, and volunteering at the local community center. That's where she met Harold. They were both part of the church's outreach program, organizing food drives and helping homebound seniors with errands. At first, they were just friendly faces in the same circle, but over time, they started seeking each other out. They began having coffee after volunteer sessions, talking about their late spouses, their adult children, and their memories of raising families in different corners of the Midwest. What started as mutual understanding slowly turned into something more intimate. Their companionship was gentle. There were no grand gestures or passionate declarations, just shared dinners, slow walks in the park, and the comforting silence of someone who simply understood. Harold admired Lorraine's grace, how she could say so much without raising her voice. Lorraine appreciated Harold's steadiness, how he never interrupted, never judged, just listened. After spending Christmas together at Lorraine's home and attending the New Year's Eve service as a couple, Harold asked her to marry him on a quiet January afternoon. He didn't plan a big proposal. He just looked at her over tea and said he didn't want to spend another year without calling her his wife. Lorraine said yes. The news wasn't well received. Lorraine's only son, Kyle, had always been possessive of his mother, especially after his father's death. He believed no one could fill that role again, and he distrusted Harold almost immediately. He told Lorraine that he thought she was being manipulated, that she was vulnerable, and this man, no matter how charming, might have hidden motives. Harold's two daughters, Brooke and Ellen, weren't pleased either. They saw the engagement as a betrayal of their mother's memory. Brooke, the older one, had always been fiercely protective of the family name. She accused Harold of moving on too fast and disrespecting the family legacy. Ellen was less vocal, but her silence spoke volumes. Neither of them made any effort to get to know Lorraine. Their minds were made up from the beginning. Despite the tension, Harold and Lorraine went ahead with the wedding. They planned a small ceremony in the church where they had first met. Their friends from the volunteer group attended, bringing flowers and warm hugs. But the pews reserved for family sat empty. The children declined their invitations without even offering excuses. There were no phone calls, no notes, just a cold absence that hovered over the event like a shadow. Still, the couple tried to keep their focus on the joy of the moment. They danced to an old record in their living room later that night, a simple celebration of love found in later life. After the wedding, they bought a modest home on the edge of town. It was a small brick house with a wraparound porch, tall oak trees in the yard, and enough space to start fresh. Lorraine planted tulips by the fence. Harold set up a bird feeder. They hoped that in time the children would come around, that once they saw how happy and sincere the relationship was, the bitterness would fade. They sent birthday cards, left voicemails, extended invitations to Sunday dinners. But there was no reply. What began as a tender second chance at love was already marked by a silent resistance. What they didn't know was that this rejection, which first appeared as emotional distance, would soon turn into something far darker, something neither of them could have predicted. The silence from their children deepened after the wedding. Weeks turned into months. and the rejection settled into the walls of Harold and Lorraine's new home like a slow, creeping fog. They tried to dismiss it at first, calling it a period of adjustment. But it soon became clear that their children weren't just avoiding them, they were punishing them. The signs were subtle at first. Lorraine noticed that Kyle had blocked her number. Her texts went unread. Her calls went to voicemail. She mailed him a birthday card with a handwritten letter and a photo of her and Harold smiling on their honeymoon. It was returned, unopened, with no note. Harold faced similar coldness. Brooke and Ellen refused to acknowledge their father's calls. One day, Harold received a group email from Ellen asking him to stop pushing this new life onto them. The message was short, sharp, and stung worse than anything he'd heard from her before. Despite this, Harold and Lorraine tried to stay positive. They hosted Sunday dinners, setting the table for 6, just in case someone changed their mind. Each time, they ate alone. They baked cookies during the holidays and mailed care packages to the children, filled with homemade treats and handwritten notes. Most were never acknowledged. The few that weren't returned arrived at their destinations with no response. Then things began to take a darker turn. One morning, Lorraine found their mailbox open, the flag bent sideways, and the mail scattered across the front yard. Among the envelopes was a note, typed on cheap printer paper with no return address. It read, "This won't last. You don't belong together. Undo the mistake." Lorraine showed it to Harold, and they tried to... Maybe it was some teenager playing a prank, they reasoned. But a week later, a second note appeared, this one more aggressive. "You think love makes you safe. You're wrong. End this sham before it ends you." This time, Lorraine didn't laugh. She folded the note carefully and hid it in the back of her desk drawer. Harold suggested going to the police, but Lorraine insisted it was nothing serious. She didn't want to escalate things. She believed, or hoped, that it would stop on its own. But it didn't. Small disturbances became more frequent. Lorraine found her flower beds trampled one morning, tulip bulbs crushed and dirt scattered across the walkway. Harold's car was keyed along the passenger side, a long, jagged scratch that hadn't been there the day before. A garden gnome they had bought on their honeymoon was smashed to pieces beside the back porch. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Someone was watching them and wanted them to feel unsafe. The couple tried to ignore it. They installed a security light by the garage and added locks to the windows, but the fear crept in regardless. Lorraine stopped going on her morning walks alone. Harold kept a baseball bat near the front door. They didn't talk much about the threats, as if speaking them aloud would give them more power. But both were thinking the same thing. This wasn't random. Late at night, Lorraine would lie awake replaying old arguments with Kyle in her head. She remembered his scorn, his obsession with protecting what he saw as his family's dignity, and his warning not to disrespect Dad's memory. She didn't want to believe her own son could be behind it. But the doubt gnawed at her. Harold felt something similar about Brooke. She had always been strong-willed, always acted like the keeper of the family's moral compass. After their mother died, she had taken it upon herself to preserve the family name, as she once told Harold during an argument. He remembered how she glared at Lorraine during their first church dinner together. It hadn't been anger, it had been something colder, contempt. Neither Lorraine nor Harold wanted to believe their children were capable of such malice. But as more notes arrived, each one more threatening than the last, the denial became harder to maintain. What had started as silent disapproval had evolved into something calculated. Someone wanted to break them. And worse, someone they once loved might have decided that the only way to fix what they saw as a mistake was to destroy it entirely. The spring months brought little peace. The air grew warmer, flowers bloomed again in the yard, and neighbors walked their dogs under the golden evening light. But inside Harold and Lorraine's home, the atmosphere was heavy with suspicion and dread. The threatening notes continued. They no longer arrived weekly, but almost every other day. Always typed, always unsigned. Some were left in the mailbox, others were slipped under the front door. Once, one was found tucked between the windshield wipers of Lorraine's car. Each note varied in tone. Some were cryptic, like riddles. Others were direct and filled with rage. "Your happy ending will be a tragedy," one read. Another said, "The world is watching. Shame is louder than you think." And the most chilling of all simply read, "One of you won't survive this." Harold took that one to the police, hoping it would finally spark action. But with no fingerprints, no envelope, and no direct threats to a specific person, there was little they could do beyond filing a report. The officers were polite but dismissive. One even implied it might just be a neighbor's prank gone too far, so they did what they could to protect themselves. Cameras were installed, one facing the porch, another by the garage. Harold began checking the locks 3 times before going to bed. Lorraine left the porch lights on all night, something she used to hate when Harold did it. Every movement outside, every creak of the floor felt suspicious. Their once quiet life had turned into a cautious game of waiting. The tension began to strain their relationship. Lorraine stopped smiling as much. Harold became withdrawn, spending more time in his study or outside pretending to rake leaves that didn't need raking. They tiptoed around conversations involving their children. The possibility that someone they loved could be tormenting them was unbearable, but it sat between them like a shadow neither wanted to point at directly. Then one evening, something changed. Lorraine received a large, padded envelope in the mail. Unlike the notes, it had a return address, a post office box from a neighboring county. Inside was a flash drive and a single line typed on plain paper. "Watch this alone, and don't tell him." Her hands trembled as she held it. She debated for nearly an hour before finally locking herself in the bedroom and plugging the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered, then played a grainy black and white video. At first, it seemed like random security footage. Then Lorraine saw something she couldn't explain. Someone standing in their driveway late at night. The person was wearing a hoodie, pacing. The footage cut to another scene. This time a gloved hand slipping a piece of paper into the mailbox. Lorraine could hear her own breath hitching. More clips followed, the same figures smashing the garden gnome, the same figures scratching Harold's car. But it was the last clip that made her blood run cold. It was taken from behind a bush across the street. Someone filming Harold and Lorraine slow dancing in their living room through the window. The camera zoomed in, capturing their smiles, their intimacy, their innocence. Then the video ended. No faces were visible, no identifying features. Just the fear left behind in its wake. Lorraine didn't tell Harold about the video that night. She couldn't. She barely slept. She kept thinking about the angle of the footage, the way it had been filmed, deliberate, intimate, obsessive. It wasn't random. Whoever was behind this knew them, watched them, hated them. The next morning, Harold noticed her distress but said nothing. Lauren almost confessed. But something held her back. A tiny voice inside warned her, "If you show him, it might break him." The fear wasn't just about who was doing this, it was about why, and more importantly, what they were planning next. Because now, it was no longer just harassment, it was surveillance. Someone wasn't just angry, they were calculating something far worse. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet, and that silence felt heavier than any of the chaos before. Lorraine moved carefully through the house, locking windows twice, checking the porch camera feed multiple times a day, and pulling the curtains shut tighter than ever. She hadn't told Harold about the flash drive. The decision haunted her, but she couldn't shake the thought that sharing it would only deepen the cracks already forming between them. Harold was trying his best to keep things normal, but his eyes often wandered to the front door, to the mailbox, to the security monitor that now flickered silently in the kitchen. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Lorraine's phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was a photo. No text, just an image. Her stomach dropped. It showed her and Harold walking out of a grocery store the day before. They were holding hands. She was smiling. Harold was laughing about something. But the angle? It was close. Too close. Whoever took it was just feet away and neither of them had noticed. Lorraine's fingers trembled as she saved the image and blocked the number. But it was too late. Whoever it was had already made their point. The feeling of being watched turned into something else entirely, a sense of being hunted. 2 days later, a strange envelope arrived, addressed to Harold. Lorraine tried to intercept it, but Harold opened it before she had a chance to warn him. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed message in bold letters. "She's hiding things from you. Ask her about the video. Ask her what she saw." Harold's face drained of color. He stared at the note, then slowly turned to Lorraine, who stood frozen in place. She had no words. Her mind raced for a way to explain without unraveling everything. But Harold didn't ask any questions. He simply folded the paper and walked out of the room, shutting the study door behind him. The silence that followed was louder than any fight they'd ever had. Later that night, Harold reemerged, his expression unreadable. He didn't bring up the letter, and Lorraine didn't offer any explanations. They sat across from each other at the dinner table, chewing in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes. Trust had cracked, and both of them felt it splintering deeper with every passing hour. But the real breaking point came a few days later, when Harold disappeared for most of the afternoon without telling Lorraine. He returned just before dark, mud on his shoes and a strange look in his eyes. That night, after he fell asleep, Lorraine checked his coat pockets and found something that made her heart stop. A printed photo, the same one she had received in the text message. Her hands trembled as she placed it back exactly how she found it. Harold hadn't said a word, but somehow he had gotten a copy too, and if she wasn't the one who gave it to him, someone else did. The next morning, she followed him. He said he was going to run errands, but Lorraine stayed behind for 10 minutes, then quietly got in her own car and drove the route he normally took. After half an hour of searching, she spotted his car parked in front of a small, local diner across town. Inside, she saw him through the window, sitting in a booth, across from someone she couldn't fully see, but as she shifted her view, she caught a glimpse of long, dark hair. The woman across from Harold looked vaguely familiar. Lorraine's blood ran cold. She realized it was Brooke, Harold's daughter. Why was he meeting her in secret? Lorraine drove away before they could see her. Her mind was spinning. Was Harold hiding things now, too? Did Brooke know about the threats? Was she involved? Or worse, orchestrating it all? The unease that had crept into their marriage was no longer just about safety. It had morphed into paranoia. If the person tormenting them had once been someone they trusted, then trust itself had become the deadliest threat of all. The walls of their once safe home now felt like a cage, and neither of them knew who was holding the key. The final days unfolded like a nightmare, slow and suffocating, each hour dragging Lorraine and Harold closer to something neither of them could name, but both could feel. A quiet dread settled in the house, a sense that whatever had started as whispered threats and cryptic letters was now escalating into something irreversible. Lorraine could hardly eat, and Harold spoke even less than before. They moved around each other like strangers in a museum of their own broken trust, every glance loaded with suspicion. Lorraine hadn't confronted Harold about his secret meeting with Brooke. She didn't need to. The betrayal of that moment, the image of her husband sitting across from the woman who had made it clear she despised their marriage, was already etched into her mind like a scar. Every time she passed him in the hallway, she saw that booth, that diner, that look on his face, and worst of all, She saw the possibility that maybe he had never stopped loving his old life, that maybe he missed the acceptance of his children more than the truth of their love. Then came the night everything collapsed. It began with a noise. Just after midnight, Lorraine was awake, lying in bed, listening to the wind scrape against the house. A distant clatter, soft but distinct, reached her ears. At first she thought it was the wind again, or the house settling. But then it came again, closer, sharper, like glass breaking. She sat up. Her instincts told her not to move, but her fear pushed her forward. She slipped out of bed and crept toward the hallway. The sound had come from downstairs. The motion light by the stairwell was on, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. She moved slowly, step by step, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. At the bottom of the stairs she saw it, the front window sattered inward, shards of glass glinting on the hardwood floor. And standing near the entryway, facing the door, was Harold. He wasn't holding a phone, he wasn't calling for help. He was standing still, too still, as if expecting something. Before Lorraine could say anything, the door burst open. A figure stormed inside, dressed in black, face covered, something metallic glinting in their hand. Lorraine screamed, and in that second, time warped. The intruder lunged at Harold. There was a struggle. Lorraine tried to run forward but froze as she saw the object clearly. A small knife, flashing with each motion. Harold fought back with a strength Lorraine hadn't seen in years. They crashed into a table, sending a lamp flying. Lorraine finally broke from her paralysis and grabbed the nearest heavy object she could find, a fire iron from the hearth. With everything she had, she struck the attacker from behind. Once, twice. The figure fell. It was only then that Harold ripped the mask off, and beneath it was Michael. Lorraine gasped and stumbled back. Her son. His face was bloodied, barely conscious, groaning in pain. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor. Harold stared down at him in stunned silence, shaking his head slowly, as though refusing to believe what was real. Later, when the police arrived and pieced together the timeline, everything unraveled quickly. Michael had been behind the letters. Brooke had been feeding him information. Their resentment had curdled into something dangerous. They had convinced themselves that if they could scare their parents apart, maybe life would go back to how it once was. But when the threats didn't work, Michael had taken it further. He had started following them, recording them, waiting, and finally planning something far darker. Lorraine never visited Michael in jail. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. Harold, for his part, wrote a letter to Brooke that was never sent. He kept it in a drawer, folded neatly, alongside the photograph of him and Lorraine holding hands, outside the grocery store. The photo that had once symbolized danger now reminded him of what they had survived. They stayed together, not out of defiance, but because what remained after the storm was something stronger than fear. A shared sorrow, an understanding that even when love endures, it sometimes does so with scars. The house became quiet again, but the silence was no longer a warning. It was a form of peace. Haunted, yes, but hard-earned.